Hey, it's Get Brocked. My voice is full of gravel right now because I woke up about an hour ago, but figured we might as well do this video. As the title implies, we're going to be talking about frigate fleets today. And by we, I mean me, unless you're helping out. But in the context of Warfare 2, or really just space engineers in general, it'll kind of be a progression, a story of sorts. Some context first. Understand most of this is pretty subjective. Modern navies, historical navies couldn't even agree what frigates were, so chances are you and I won't fully agree what frigates were. But the base premise of the video is roughly the same, right? The concept applies. Small ships-ish relative to the larger ships. A frigate for us is basically the smallest warship. Note, not small ship, but smallest warship meant for space combat. For us, that equates to 2,000 blocks or so, 5 weapons, so 5 turrets allowed, and 10 points to spend on the turrets. We have a point system for our turrets. We also have a light, medium, and heavy category. For comparison, a destroyer is about 3,500 blocks, 14 turrets, and 20 points. Considering a destroyer only takes half a turn more to construct, a frigate takes half a turn to construct, a destroyer for us takes a full turn to construct. You get the idea. Now, more than likely in your space engineer's world, there is no turn construction system. You just build the ship. This is just kind of context here. From here, you can see in our PvP series, system, server, whatever you want to call it, destroyers were kind of the dominant force, and all of the factions used regular frigates as their utility ship, troop transport, right, to get for certain encounters. And the destroyer was kind of the workhorse of the navies, right? If you need problem solved now, you send destroyers. You need escort, you send destroyers. You need, a front line, you send destroyers. I mean, you can see why. Functionally, it has 3 times the weapons, but only double the cost. So you could expect a destroyer to potentially go toe-to-toe with 2 to 3 frigates, according to the paper, quote-unquote. And this sort of bore out in how the series played out. The meta, if you want to call it, for most of Season 1 was such that destroyers were the value option, what you use as your bulk force. It was the most efficient ship in terms of build to time to build to quality of ship ratio, right? Right. Everyone wants a battleship, but the battleship costs exponentially more and is questionably better than something like 15 destroyers in its place. We also have light cruisers, heavy cruisers, and they filled in as the dominant capital ship, and you would deploy these alongside destroyers or maybe even frigates when you needed more oomph. For example, you're assaulting a hardened position or you want to crack through a lighter formation. Light and heavy cruisers cost upwards of 4 times more, or even more than that, than a destroyer to make, so imagine cost about 5 destroyers to make a heavy cruiser, for example, roughly. Thus, we quickly saw everyone would actually look to man the front line, right? They need all of the squadrons filled and locations manned, etc. And they would plug those with the destroyers. Then, when able, cruisers would be slotted in for critical squadrons that needed offensive or defensive capability, and it kind of boosted the combat capability of a squadron with heavy weapons, right? Destroyers can't really have heavy weapons. Frigates, the topic of this video, got almost completely sidelined as irrelevant, right? It just didn't seem worth the cost. Half of the build time, it didn't seem worth the cost, right? And most factions, after initially having frigates on the front line, as war developed, they were relegated away from fleet combat duty and into garrison, troop transport, or mission-specific type duties. As the season went on, it quickly became apparent that destroyers were disproportionately good in space engineers. I have to reiterate, we have a balance system. The reality is you could probably shove 400 capital grade weapons on a small frigate and have the best ship in the world. Yes, of course. But if you have some kind of balance system in place, this plays out. Due to the destroyer's ability to not only speed tank, that is, their ability to rapidly course correct all the time, resulted in a ship that was basically had similar survivability to something like a cruiser against a destroyer. And the cruiser has the armor, but the destroyer was so mobile that in the end, the survival times were roughly on par. Now, cruisers still had massive benefits, like the ability to actually take hits, always going to take a hit at some point. And this was very important in larger battles, or battles that required tight formations, and it was a little less, everyone for themselves status as destroyer squadrons tended to play out as. They also bring capital grade weapons, which, have their uses, right? For us, our capital grade weapons pack a heavy punch and have a significantly longer engage range. So we ended Season 1 with the following meta. Destroyers are the workhorse. Cruisers, as the faction's relative wealth increased, became kind of the predominant focus. Since the destroyers were properly manning the front, casualty rates weren't that low. Well, the cruisers were the focus, and destroyers were being slotted out for cruisers, and we ended up seeing a lot of 2 cruisers, 2 destroyers, or 1 cruiser, 3 destroyer squadrons. We even saw some super squadrons come out, right? The light battleship Ravager, armored cruiser Warspite, armored cruiser Elysium, and armored cruiser Vesuvius created a super squadron meant to break through formations and kind of be the tip of the spear for the COA faction. And then the topic of the video, frigates, they were not loved. They cried themselves in the corner and no one cared about them. Then Season 2 came along and everything went to 11. Actually, everything went to 13, and it was spicy. All previous statements were void in an instant. As the battles begin to occur, there were a lot of factors that combined simultaneously to completely shift the meta of the game. The big one being attrition, that is loss of vessels or damaging of vessels, being significantly higher than Season 1 or Season 2. Season 1, it was not unreasonable to expect ships to make it through a battle without needing to be repaired. Season 2, that was almost never the case. On top of that, actual ship hull losses, like total write-offs basically, was through the roof. The COA Alliance, in about 8 episodes, lost more than all of Season 1 combined. And Season 1 was 23 episodes. The notion of the cruiser becoming the new meta, surpassing destroyers, just instantly vanished. It's not that cruisers were bad. It's that cruisers were not cost-effective, relatively speaking. Yes, you always wanted a cruiser as a backbone, but the ability to just always have cruisers was impossible. It was too expensive. As squadrons were being in a permanent state of repair, retreat, or assault, and attrition rates were through the roof, you had to be able to reinforce these squadrons to have the correct number of ships to be useful, right? 1 cruiser, 1 destroyer is not comparable to 4 destroyers. So we needed to fill the gaps. And the COA, in a degree, shifted to production of destroyers. The 2 factions, specifically Riders and Khan's Enclave, exclusively produced only destroyers for the first part of the season, simply just to fill the gap of this new intense war. Only the CDF, who have a huge reserve of destroyers, was able to continue her cruiser production throughout Season 2. As fighting picked up even further, casualties even higher, and the question was beginning to be asked, are destroyers not even coming out fast enough? Can we fill the line with frigates instead, thus being able to keep momentum up in other areas instead of just distributing out forces across the line? Remember, for us, you could build 2 frigates for every 1 destroyer. Now, as a quick aside, once again, I understand most servers don't use this system, but the fundamental premise still stands. You can build more smaller ships than you can the bigger ship, right? Make sense? Makes sense. So, concept still applies, but I'm using an example here. This was a very interesting strategy that was being formulated by one of the newer factions who are very forward-thinking and out-of-the-box thinking. Combined that fundamental question, frigates better than destroyers? This was an interesting strategy from a faction that was very forward-thinking, out-of-the-box thinking, and that question, 2 frigates for every 1 destroyer, do we just build frigates instead? Brings up a really cool historical thing. Historically, this refers to a time in history where naval doctrine was very much up in the air, almost literally too, in real life. As World War I was over and World War II was understandably on the horizon, naval doctrine was up in the air, right? And different countries were scrambling to figure out what the real life meta was going to be for the next big war. No one knew it was World War II yet, but they knew it probably was going to be coming. We had the traditional school of thought, which was the decisive battle doctrine with large capital ships and singular battles. Ironically, this is the Rider doctrine. Even though they're building destroyers to fill their losses, they keep all of their heavy capital ships all in one squadron because they are all about decisive singular battle wins. We had the aircraft and carrier camp, where the carrier brings the aircraft to the battle, that believed the versatility, long-range strike capability, and lethality of the aircraft would rule the day, thus carriers. We also had the destroyer camp, based around smoke screens and the usage of torpedoes, which in mock exercises proved quite devastating. A lot of countries, while they never fully committed to destroyers, had a very robust destroyer doctrine going into World War II, with a lot of emphasis spent on creating a very good torpedo, usage of smoke screens, good destroyer doctrine, and night fighting capability, which really helps destroyers come into their own. Namely, the Japanese were a big fan of this because they wanted to use destroyers to weaken the American battle line as it approached Japan. Thus, when the final battle did happen, they would be weaker. This didn't play out, but their destroyers were quite effective. This kind of ends up being the CDF doctrine in a lot of ways. They have a very strong destroyer base, and they work on this a lot, and they have a very strong capital base. And the logic is the destroyers can kind of just go to the meat grinder, and then when the cruisers come in, they clean up almost. And then obviously there's the submarine camp, but that doesn't really apply to space engineers because everything is a submarine to a degree. But anyway, and then finally we have the small ship doctrine, which is the core of this video, the Génie École doctrine. This referred to, at the time, a growing sentiment, especially, I believe in France, but also other nations. Battleships were cripplingly expensive, enough to bankrupt a nation to a degree. And France was having some serious money issues at this point. And to a degree, a lot of people were asking the questions, are battleships actually useful? Because a lot of times they found that battleships weren't even used, because they were your answer to the other navy's big ships. So a large percentage of your very expensive navy would be stuck in dock, waiting to react to the enemy's big ships, and the enemy's big ships would be scared of moving somewhere because of that large enemy, right? The big dynamic was Britain with their home fleet stuck in Scarpa, whatever. And the German Navy being afraid to move out until that decisive battle day because they needed as many ships as possible for that. And you had a huge amount of material, military material, just sitting there, right? And it just didn't do as much. Now, Britain had a large enough navy that they could have other ships doing things, but Germany, for most of World War I, their navy just sat on its ass until the big battle came, and then it went back to sitting on its ass. The logic was, what about a navy that can actually do something without just being overwhelmingly large? Thus, the small or cheap frigate or even gunboat with mass swarm attacks became a potential concept, and in testing, the destroyers were already capable of doing this, and this was like, let's crank it to 12. The goal is never to win, per se. There is no illusion that a group of 30 ships could sink a British or German line formation. No. But the goal was to inflict enough damage that they'd have to go home and then repair, and thus not be in battle. This isn't in real life. Repairs take months and sometimes years on large capital ships. Think of something like the Tirpitz. But instead of planes keeping it out of the fight, you would use a swarm of small vessels to cripple the vessel, send it home, and consume a large amount of resources and essentially be useless. Meanwhile, after doing this engagement, where you probably lost a lot of your small but cheap ships, and the enemy probably won the battle, but they lost or had damaged a lot of their larger ships, which had to go home, and you keep doing that, and eventually all their stuff is at home repairing. Meanwhile, your ships are free to do things like harass commerce, convoys, whatever. Because remember, the goal of naval power isn't to win naval battles. The goal of naval power is to exploit or protect the shipping lanes, right? Control the sea. In practice, this didn't work out. Destroyers ended up killing these ships a little too well, and cruisers were a little too versatile in their performance. And the ultimate issue was Britain was just a big honker, and yeah. Turns out, when you sink their capital ships, they have a couple too many in reserve. Oh yeah, that's right, we are talking about space engineers. Regardless, the question was asked in a period where capital ships were too expensive and even destroyers were potentially too expensive. Could frigates be deployed in a large enough scale that they might offset the issue of just being an inferior ship, fighting ship? The goal, once again, isn't to have a formation of frigates that supersedes a destroyer formation or even a cruiser formation. The goal was to offer parity such that you could have cheaper formations in certain areas, thus having more expensive formations elsewhere. There was a talent that actually was developed well before this discussion took place. Initially, it was called Advanced Frigate Combat, but we renamed it when we realized what was happening here behind the scenes. The Genetic Hull Doctrine, to make it sound more esoteric. It allowed a squadron. We allow squadrons to only be 4 ships. It allowed a squadron to be 5 ships if 4 of those ships were frigates. That allowed, you to have 5 frigates, 4 frigates and a destroyer, 4 frigates and a cruiser, 4 frigates and a battleship. Well, how did this play out, right? Like, that's the big thing with Space Engineers Outlands. That's cool. We can see stuff like this actually play out in back-to-back battles. Turns out it worked excellently. In Space Engineers, 90% of destroyer combat, because a frigate and a destroyer are functionally both, made out of paper, considering their size and the strength of the weapons they're going up against. 90% of destroyer combat was destroyers spinning around each other until they get that one good volley. Sure, they'd get hit by incidental fire, but that one good volley would do more damage than the entire battle up to this point. So, when you're in a 1v1 setting, they're just dodging this entire time until one side, messes up and the other side gets a good volley, and that cripples the ship and its combat capability goes through the floor. Turns out, when you do a 2v1, when you can gang up on a ship, with that second angle of missiles, the dodge chance goes from something like 90% of dodge capability to like 50 or 40%. Turns out, it didn't really matter if you hit it with 15 missiles at once or a volley of 5 missiles twice or once. Didn't really end up mattering. You get that one good volley and the ship is being mobility killed, bridge sniped, damage to the reactor, whatever. So, people quickly realized winning wasn't about, bringing the most firepower. It was local supremacy and winning fights, right? Defeat in detail, if you want to call it. And the frigate, which allowed you to bring one extra ship, not only began to saturate the enemy's fire capabilities, especially something like a cruiser, which doesn't actually have as many weapons as these smaller ships, but they have bigger weapons, allowed both the ability to kind of distract some enemies, but gain fire superiority in other areas. And this proved incredibly good. Was this a better formation? No. In practice, it was roughly on par, probably worse. But how much worse? In practice, the numbers don't lie, it was basically on par. Remember, the formation cost almost nothing to deploy, and then when you put a cruiser in the formation as the key linchpin that kind of hunts down the targets that are being pinned by the frigates, while other frigates are distracting in an almost disposable manner, this formation ended up being way better than anyone thought. Thus, the question is, where does this formation sit? Well, it's kind of in the middle of things. It allows you to have a cheap formation that is capable of inflicting damage, but it's also a kind of high-risk, low reward scenario, especially if you have cruisers, and especially now that Warfare 2 is making cruisers incredibly lethal with target fixation, subsystem targeting, whatever. The point is, Warfare 2 has made cruisers incredibly lethal. Heavy weapons that rely on accuracy are now more accurate, thus the cruiser is really strong. If you roll in and try to pin a cruiser with frigates and you don't do it right, that cruiser will tear you to pieces. On paper, a cruiser, and we've seen this in action, a cruiser reinforced by almost anything, it will even come out on top on a numerically inferior fight. However, in practice, things never really play out like that. Frigates are fast, agile, and most importantly, they don't care about their own lives. This allows them to act in a way no other ship formation can, and we've seen multiple times where these ships go in on a one-way journey and act so aggressively that, and they can only act that way because they're disposable, allowed them to not only trade, but to actually come out with a win because they took the defending formation on. They caught them by surprise, essentially. There is a probably one of the most famous battles in the series, one of the most defining battles in the series, were that super formation I talked about. 3 armored cruisers, which are better cruisers, and 1 battleship went up against a very light formation, and that formation went in with no expectations of winning. Their only goal was to cripple the battleship such that the formation would be ground to a halt and have to wait for the battleship to be repaired. But it was so aggressively executed, not only did they accomplish that goal, but they actually forced the enemy formation to retreat. Okay, that was a lot of talking, and at the end of the day, it's going to kind of be up to you, the builder, the tactician, to decide where this lies for you in Space Engineers right now. Because the reality is, this frigate formation isn't the end-all be-all. Absolutely not. And if anything, it requires a certain mindset and a certain skill set to utilize. For some people, this type of formation will just get immediately meat grindered and die. But for some people, this works really well, especially if the goal isn't necessarily to win, though winning is still on the cards with this type of formation. Also, as battles become more and more intense and winning is the only objective, I imagine destroyers are going to be used in a disposable fashion, and when you start having that mindset, well, the frigate starts becoming worse and worse. Regardless, these fleet frigates, as we've begun to call them, which are characterized by having no armor, high agility, and 0 defensive weapons, so no point defense. Their only goal is to kill other ships, so only offensive medium weapons. But I foresee these kind of having had their heyday already in our series, and they're going to start to be relegated to backline or QRF, quick reaction force type forces, or as a kind of element to keep a offensive move going. So you roll in with your cruiser, destroyer, and as your cruisers peel out for being damaged or your destroyers peel out for being damaged, you keep the formation going by just shuffling in disposable frigates. Regardless, there was no real final conclusion here. This is more just data, because it's all different for everyone based off your mods, based off of your experience, based off of your team's capabilities, a number of factors, right? So hopefully you enjoyed this, found this interesting, whatever. I thought this was super cool, as I don't think anyone expected this to happen, where frigates were going toe-to-toe with cruiser formations. Granted, the frigates were backed up by 1 cruiser, but the talent was kind of meant to be picked as a utility talent to kind of provide escort for carriers or battleships. We never expected this to be a viable fleet fighting comp, and no one was supposed to pick it for this season, but people picked it, and it turned out really good, at least for a small amount of time. Regardless, hopefully you enjoyed this. I have a lot of other theory-type videos like this. I'll link that in the playlist at the end, whatever. But hopefully you enjoyed it. See you guys later.